The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as recruits lined up for their daily inspection. Among them stood Sarah Martinez, a 22-year-old woman whose small frame seemed almost lost in the sea of towering male cadets. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, boots polished to a mirror shine, and her dark hair pulled back in regulation style. Yet none of this seemed to matter to her fellow trainees. "Look who decided to play soldier today," whispered Jake Morrison, a burly cadet from Texas, whose voice carried enough venom to make nearby recruits snicker. "Shouldn't you be in the kitchen making sandwiches instead of pretending to be one of us?" Sarah kept her eyes forward, jaw clenched tight as more whispers and muffled laughter rippled through the formation. This had become her daily reality for the past 8 weeks at Fort Harrison Military Academy. Every morning brought the same cruel comments, the same dismissive glances, the same assumption that she didn't belong among the elite training program's candidates. "Martinez probably got in through some diversity quota," muttered another voice behind her. "No way she earned her spot here like the rest of us." The comments stung more than Sarah would ever admit. What her fellow cadets didn't know was that she had scored higher on the entrance exams than 90% of them. Her physical fitness tests placed her in the top 15% of all applicants, male or female. She had graduated summa cum laude from West Point with degrees in both military strategy and international relations. But none of that seemed to matter when faced with the prejudice of her peers. Sergeant Williams, their drill instructor, marched down the line with his usual stern expression. He was a weathered veteran of 3 combat deployments, known for his no-nonsense approach and ability to break even the toughest recruits. When he reached Sarah, his pace slowed slightly. "Martinez," he barked, "step forward." Sarah's heart sank. She had done nothing wrong, followed every order to the letter, maintained perfect form during exercises. Yet being singled out in front of the group meant only one thing: more ammunition for her tormentors. "Yes, Sergeant," she responded, stepping forward with military precision. Williams circled her like a predator examining its prey. The other cadets watched with barely concealed glee, expecting another humiliation to unfold before their eyes. "Your uniform is impeccable," Williams said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Your bearing is exemplary. Your performance in tactical exercises has been—" He paused dramatically. "Outstanding." The smirks began to fade from several faces as confusion replaced anticipation. This wasn't the dressing down they had expected. "However," Williams continued, "I've been hearing complaints from some of your fellow cadets. They seem to think you don't belong here." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The sergeant was going to dress her down after all, validate every cruel comment and sneer she had endured. "What they don't realize," Williams said, turning to face the entire formation, "is that Martinez here has been holding back. She's been going easy on all of you during combat training, following orders to blend in rather than dominate." The confusion on the cadets' faces deepened. Jake Morrison's confident smirk wavered as uncertainty crept into his expression. "You see, gentlemen," Williams announced, "what you don't know about Cadet Martinez could fill a library. But what's most relevant today is that she's been playing a role, following specific instructions from command to observe, evaluate, and report on this unit's cohesion and leadership potential." Sarah maintained her rigid posture, but inside, her mind was racing. This wasn't part of any plan she knew about. Williams was improvising, though she couldn't understand why. "Martinez," Williams commanded, "show these boys what you're really capable of. Morrison, front and center. You've been running your mouth for weeks about how women don't belong in combat roles. Time to put your money where your mouth is." Jake stepped forward with false bravado. Though his earlier confidence was clearly shaken, he outweighed Sarah by at least 60 pounds and stood nearly a foot taller. The other cadets formed a circle, expecting to see their female colleague finally put in her place. What happened next would be talked about in hushed tones for months afterward. Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost inhuman. Jake's first clumsy attempt at a takedown was countered so smoothly it looked choreographed. Within seconds, he found himself face down in the dirt with his arm twisted behind his back, completely immobilized. "Holy shit," someone whispered, breaking the stunned silence. Sarah released Jake and helped him to his feet with professional courtesy. His face was red with embarrassment and confusion as he dusted off his uniform. "Again," Williams ordered. "Thompson, you're next." One by one, Sarah systematically demonstrated her superiority over every cadet who had mocked her. Not with cruelty or revenge, but with clinical efficiency that left no doubt about her capabilities. Each takedown was textbook perfect, each counterattack precisely executed. By the time she had worked through half the formation, the mood had shifted completely. The jeers and whispers had been replaced by respectful silence and wide-eyed amazement. These young men who had spent weeks convincing themselves that Sarah was a weak link in their chain were being forced to confront a very different reality. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" asked Tommy Chen, one of the few cadets who had never participated in the harassment, but had remained silent during it. Sarah glanced at Williams, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Special Forces training," she replied simply. 3 tours in Afghanistan, counter-terrorism operations in Syria, advanced combat instructor certification from Fort Bragg. The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. They had been mocking a decorated combat veteran, someone who had seen more action than all of them combined. "But the Academy records," Jake stammered, his worldview crumbling around him. "Show exactly what they're supposed to show," Williams interjected. "Sometimes the military needs to test more than just individual skills. Sometimes we need to evaluate leadership potential, character under pressure, and ability to see past surface appearances." The sergeant's words hung heavy in the air as the implications sank in. They had all failed a test they didn't even know they were taking. Sarah looked at each face in turn, seeing a mixture of shame, respect, and dawning understanding. These weren't bad people, she realized. They were young men shaped by stereotypes and assumptions, products of a culture that told them women couldn't be warriors. They had reacted predictably to what they perceived as an intrusion into their world. "The question now," Williams continued, "is what you do with this knowledge. How you treat not just Martinez, but every soldier who doesn't fit your preconceived notions of what a warrior should look like." As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows that had cloaked the training ground, something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of the unit. Sarah was no longer the outsider struggling to prove herself. She had become something far more complex. A teacher, a mirror, and a challenge to everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and belonging. The real test, however, was just beginning. What none of them knew was that in less than 24 hours, their entire world would be turned upside down once again, and Sarah Martinez would reveal the true extent of her identity and purpose at Fort Harrison. The barracks hummed with nervous energy that evening as word of the day's events spread like wildfire through Fort Harrison. Sarah Martinez sat on her bunk, methodically cleaning her gear while conversations swirled around her in hushed tones. The dynamic had shifted dramatically. Where once there had been mockery and exclusion, now there was cautious respect mixed with burning curiosity. Jake Morrison approached her bunk hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. What I said, what we all said, it was wrong." Sarah looked up from her rifle, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. "Apology accepted, Morrison. But understand something. I've heard worse from enemies who were actively trying to kill me. Words only have the power you give them. Tommy Chen gathered the courage to join the conversation. Those tours you mentioned, what was it really like over there? A shadow passed across Sarah's face as memories surfaced unbidden. Sand-colored buildings riddled with bullet holes, the weight of full combat gear in 100-degree heat, the constant awareness that death could come from any direction at any moment. Different than anything you can imagine, she replied simply, and exactly what you'd expect, all at the same time. The evening progressed with more cadets approaching, drawn by curiosity and shame in equal measure. Sarah answered their questions with military brevity, neither boasting about her accomplishments nor dwelling on the horrors she had witnessed. She spoke of firefights with the same matter-of-fact tone she used to describe equipment maintenance. The thing about combat, she explained to the growing circle of listeners, is that it strips away everything that doesn't matter. Rank, gender, background, none of it counts when bullets start flying. The only thing that matters is whether you can do your job and keep your team alive. Private Williams entered the barracks for evening inspection, but instead of his usual stern demeanor, he seemed almost satisfied. He surveyed the scene of cadets gathered around Sarah with approval before calling the room to attention. "Tomorrow we have a special exercise," he announced. "A joint training operation with units from across the base. You'll be evaluated on everything you've learned over the past 2 months. Leadership, tactical thinking, unit cohesion. The works." After lights out, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, knowing what tomorrow would bring. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. The time for her cover story was rapidly approaching its end. Dawn broke gray and overcast, matching the serious mood that had settled over the training ground. Multiple units had assembled for what appeared to be an elaborate war game exercise. Sarah noticed several high-ranking officers observing from a nearby viewing platform, more brass than she had seen since arriving at Fort Harrison. The cadets were divided into teams and given a complex scenario involving hostage rescue and terrorist neutralization. Sarah found herself assigned to Jake's team, a deliberate choice that wasn't lost on either of them. "What's your read on this?" Jake asked as they studied the tactical layout. The respect in his voice was genuine, a far cry from his earlier condescension. Sarah examined the mock battlefield with professional eyes, noting sight lines, cover positions, and potential ambush points. "It's more complex than it appears. See those secondary buildings? They're positioned to create crossfire opportunities. Whoever designed this knows what they're doing." As the exercise began, Sarah initially held back, following Jake's lead as team commander. But when the scenario evolved beyond the cadet's experience level, she gradually assumed a more active role. Her suggestions were subtle but decisive, guiding the team through obstacles that would have otherwise stopped them cold. "How did you know about the hidden sniper position?" Tommy asked during a brief respite. "Because I helped design similar training scenarios at Fort Bragg," Sarah replied, then caught herself. She had revealed more than intended. The exercise continued with increasing complexity, and it became clear that Sarah's team was performing at a level far superior to the others. Her combat experience showed in dozens of small ways: the way she moved through urban terrain, how she anticipated enemy positions, her ability to coordinate team movements under pressure. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, stood on the observation platform watching the proceedings with intense interest. Beside him, a woman in dress uniform observed silently, her face hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. "Sir," an aide whispered to the colonel, "the Martinez exercise is proceeding as planned. Her unit has successfully completed all objectives." Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. "And the other teams?" "Standard performance, sir. Nothing exceptional." As the exercise reached its climax, an unexpected complication arose. Real emergency sirens began blaring across the base, and all training activities were immediately halted. The cadets looked around in confusion as military police vehicles raced past their position. "This is not a drill!" boomed a voice over the loudspeaker system. "All personnel remain in place for security sweep." Sarah felt her training kick in automatically. While the other cadets stood frozen in confusion, she was already scanning for threats, counting escape routes, and positioning herself to protect her team. Years of real combat experience had taught her that danger could emerge from anywhere at any moment. Minutes stretched into an hour as MP units systematically cleared each section of the training ground. Finally, Colonel Harrison himself approached their position, flanked by armed guards. "Cadets, you've performed admirably today," he announced, "but this exercise has revealed something that requires immediate attention." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, though her expression remained neutral. She had been dreading and anticipating this moment in equal measure. "It has come to our attention," the colonel continued, "that one member of this unit has been operating under false pretenses. Cadet Martinez, step forward." The bottom dropped out of Jake's stomach as he watched Sarah move to attention in front of the colonel. After yesterday's revelations about her combat experience, he had thought nothing could surprise him further. He was wrong. "Remove your cover," Colonel Harrison commanded. Sarah complied, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders as she removed her military cap. "State your true name and rank for the record." Sarah's voice carried a new authority that made the cadets standing behind her straighten unconsciously. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Elena Martinez, United States Army Special Operations Command." The words hit the assembled cadets like a physical blow. Lieutenant Colonel. The rank was so far above their own that it seemed impossible. Jake felt his knees go weak as the full implications crashed over him. "Furthermore," Colonel Harrison continued, "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez is here on direct orders from the Pentagon as part of a comprehensive evaluation of training protocols and unit leadership development." Tommy Chen's mouth fell open as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The mysterious high-ranking officers observing the exercise. Sergeant Williams's strange behavior yesterday. The complex training scenario that seemed designed to showcase Sarah's abilities. "For the past 8 weeks, the colonel explained, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has been conducting a classified assessment of this program while maintaining her cover as a junior cadet. Her mission was to evaluate not just individual performance, but the unit's ability to recognize and develop leadership potential regardless of initial appearances." Sarah remained at attention, but she could feel the weight of dozens of stares burning into her back. These young men had spent weeks dismissing her as weak, inadequate, unworthy of their respect. Now they were learning that she outranked every officer on the base except the colonel himself. "The results of this evaluation will determine the future structure of training programs throughout the military," Harrison announced. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, present your preliminary findings." Sarah turned to face the cadets, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Harrison, she allowed her true personality to show. The uncertain young woman they had mocked was gone, replaced by a seasoned combat veteran and military strategist whose presence commanded immediate respect. The initial phase revealed significant deficiencies in leadership recognition and unit cohesion, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding troops in life-or-death situations. However, subsequent developments have shown remarkable adaptability and potential for growth. Her eyes found Jake's face in the crowd, then Tommy's, then each of the cadets who had either mocked her or remained silent during her harassment. "Recommendations will include both commendations and areas requiring immediate improvement," she continued. "Full details will be provided in my classified report to Pentagon leadership." The weight of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Their careers, their futures, their very presence in the program now depended on the assessment of the woman they had spent weeks trying to drive away. As the formal announcement concluded and the cadets were dismissed, Jake approached Sarah with visible trepidation. "Ma'am," he began, the new title feeling strange on his tongue. "I don't know what to say." Sarah studied his face for a long moment before responding. "Then say nothing, Morrison. Actions matter more than words. Show me you've learned something from this experience." The implications of the revelation were still sinking in as the cadets made their way back to the barracks. Their world had been turned completely upside down, and they were beginning to understand that their real education was just beginning. 3 days had passed since the revelation that shook Fort Harrison to its core, and the atmosphere in the barracks remained thick with tension and uncertainty. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, whisked away for high-level debriefings that would determine not just the fate of their unit, but potentially reshape military training protocols across all branches. Jake Morrison sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper that was supposed to become his official statement about the past 8 weeks. How do you summarize the complete destruction of everything you thought you knew about leadership, courage, and character? How do you admit that you spent weeks actively undermining someone who could have destroyed your career with a single word? Tommy Chen broke the heavy silence. "Anyone hear anything about when we'll get our evaluations?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone knew their futures hung in the balance, dependent on the assessment of a woman they had fundamentally misjudged from day one. "I keep thinking about all the things she must have heard," whispered Private Rodriguez, one of the quieter members of their unit. "Every comment, every joke, every time we questioned whether she belonged here." "She could have ended any of us at any moment," Jake replied, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "One word to Colonel Harrison about harassment or creating a hostile environment, and our military careers would have been over before they started." The door to the barracks swung open, and Sergeant Williams entered with his usual authoritative stride. But something was different about his demeanor. There was a satisfaction in his expression that the cadets had never seen before. "Listen up," he barked, bringing the room to attention. "You're being moved to a new phase of training, effective immediately. Pack your gear. Transport leaves in 30 minutes. "Where are we going, Sergeant?" Jake asked. Williams almost smiled. "Advanced Leadership Development Center. Congratulations, gentlemen. You just became part of an elite program that normally takes years to qualify for." The cadets exchanged confused glances. This was the opposite of what they had expected. Instead of punishment or dismissal, they were being fast-tracked into one of the military's most prestigious training programs. "I don't understand," Tommy said. "After everything that happened—" "What happened," Williams interrupted, "is that you underwent one of the most comprehensive leadership evaluations ever conducted by the U.S. military, and despite your initial failures, you demonstrated something that can't be taught in any classroom." He paused, ensuring he had their complete attention. "You demonstrated the ability to recognize your mistakes, adapt your behavior, and show genuine respect for proven leadership regardless of your initial prejudices. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez specifically recommended each of you for advanced training." The revelation hit them like a thunderbolt. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, and undermined had advocated for their advancement rather than their punishment. 30 minutes later, they found themselves boarding a military transport aircraft bound for Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The flight gave them time to process the extraordinary turn their lives had taken and to contemplate what lay ahead. Upon arrival at the Leadership Development Center, they were greeted by Colonel Patricia Hendricks, a stern woman whose reputation for producing exceptional officers was legendary throughout the military. "You gentlemen represent an interesting experiment," she announced as they stood at attention in the center's main briefing room. "You've been selected not because of your initial performance, but because of your capacity for growth under extraordinary circumstances." She gestured to a large screen behind her that displayed their training records from Fort Harrison. "Each of you demonstrated significant character development during what you believed was routine cadet training. What you didn't know was that every interaction, every response to stress, every moment of doubt or growth was being carefully documented and analyzed. Jake felt his cheeks burn as he realized the full scope of the evaluation they had unknowingly undergone. Every cruel comment, every moment of doubt, every gradual shift in their attitudes had been recorded and studied. The woman you knew as Cadet Martinez is one of the most decorated officers in Special Operations, Colonel Hendricks continued. She volunteered for this assignment because she believes the military's future depends on developing leaders who can see past surface appearances and recognize true capability. The screen shifted to display Sarah's actual military record, and the cadets gasped at the extent of her accomplishments. Multiple combat deployments, commendations for valor under fire, advanced degrees in military strategy and psychology, certifications in specialized combat techniques that most soldiers never even heard of. She could have chosen any assignment in the world, Hendricks explained. Instead, she spent 8 weeks being insulted and dismissed by recruits who had accomplished a fraction of what she had done by their age. Do any of you understand the level of discipline and character that required? Tommy raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, why didn't she just reveal who she was from the beginning? It would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Because, came a familiar voice from the back of the room, real leadership isn't about commanding respect through rank or intimidation. It's about earning it through competence, character, and dedication. Every head in the room turned as Sarah Martinez entered, now wearing her proper uniform with full insignia. The transformation was startling. Where once they had seen an uncertain cadet, now stood a confident officer whose presence commanded immediate attention. Leadership, she continued, moving to stand beside Colonel Hendricks, is about seeing potential in others, even when they can't see it in themselves. It's about maintaining your standards and values regardless of how others treat you. She looked directly at Jake as she spoke, and he felt the full weight of her words. Each of you had a choice during those 8 weeks. You could have stood up to the harassment, could have recognized competence regardless of its source, could have demonstrated the leadership qualities the military desperately needs. Instead, you followed the crowd, made assumptions, and allowed prejudice to cloud your judgment. The silence in the room was deafening. However, Sarah continued, when confronted with evidence that contradicted your assumptions, you adapted. When forced to acknowledge your mistakes, you accepted responsibility. When given the opportunity to show respect for proven capability, you rose to the occasion. She began pacing in front of them, her bearing that of a seasoned combat veteran addressing her troops. The military is changing. The threats we face today require leaders who can see past stereotypes, who can recognize and develop talent regardless of its packaging, who can build teams based on capability rather than comfort. Sarah stopped in front of Jake, holding his gaze with steady eyes. Morrison, what did you learn from this experience? Jake swallowed hard, knowing that his response would be crucial to his future. Ma'am, I learned that my assumptions about leadership were completely wrong. I judged based on appearances rather than performance. I let prejudice blind me to obvious competence. And what will you do differently going forward? I'll evaluate people based on their actions and capabilities, not their demographics. I'll stand up against harassment and discrimination, even when it's easier to stay silent. And I'll remember that real strength isn't about intimidating others. It's about lifting them up. Sarah nodded approvingly, then moved to address the group as a whole. You're here because you demonstrated the capacity for growth that the modern military desperately needs. The next phase of your training will be unlike anything you've experienced before. You'll learn advanced leadership techniques, study complex military strategy, and be prepared for roles that require both tactical brilliance and moral courage. Colonel Hendricks stepped forward. You'll also be working directly with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez as your primary instructor. She'll be developing new training protocols based on her evaluation of your unit, and you'll be the first class to experience these enhanced methods. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The woman they had tried to exclude from their group was now responsible for their advanced education. Over the following months, Sarah proved to be an extraordinary instructor. Her teaching methods were unlike anything they had experienced. She combined real-world combat experience with cutting-edge leadership theory, creating scenarios that challenged both their tactical skills and their moral reasoning. She pushed them harder than any instructor they had ever encountered, but she also supported their development with unwavering dedication. When Jake struggled with advanced tactical planning, she spent hours working with him individually. When Tommy doubted his leadership abilities, she provided guidance that helped him recognize his own potential. Most importantly, she taught them to see leadership as a responsibility to others rather than a privilege for themselves. She showed them how to recognize and develop talent in their subordinates, how to maintain standards while showing compassion, and how to make difficult decisions under pressure. The transformation was remarkable. The young men who had once mocked a female cadet became officers who actively promoted diversity and inclusion. They learned to see strength in vulnerability, wisdom in humility, and power in the ability to admit mistakes and learn from them. 6 months after their arrival at the Leadership Development Center, Jake Morrison stood before a panel of senior officers defending his thesis on adaptive leadership in diverse military units. His research, supervised by Sarah Martinez, had become a cornerstone of new training protocols being implemented across all branches of the military. The greatest leaders, he concluded his presentation, are those who can recognize and develop potential in others regardless of initial appearances or personal biases. They understand that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from empowering them to exceed their own expectations. As he finished, Jake caught sight of Sarah in the back of the room. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod of approval, and he felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with growth, learning, and becoming the kind of leader others could trust and follow. The young men who had once mocked the new cadet had become officers worthy of the uniform they wore and the trust placed in them. They had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true leadership begins with the courage to question your own assumptions and the wisdom to grow from your mistakes. And Sarah Martinez, the decorated combat veteran who had endured weeks of harassment to teach them this lesson, watched with satisfaction as they prepared to lead the next generation of soldiers with the knowledge that strength comes in many forms and that the greatest battles are often won not through force, but through understanding, respect, and the recognition that everyone has something valuable to contribute.